Welcome back to Religion at Work. Last time, we explored the religious layers of the deep story people should work. We saw that there's a moral claim embedded in how we in the United States talk about work, a moral claim we can trace back to white Protestants' vision for how the world should be. But it's not just religion that's involved here. This deep story also has a lot to do with race. In this episode, we'll look at the historically narrow white Protestant vision of what work should be, which is work done mostly by white Europeans to sustain themselves and to maintain their power. That's the kind of work that they saw as moral, the kind of work that people should do. But that category of work leaves out all kinds of other work done by people who are not white Europeans, especially free and enslaved Black people in this country and indigenous peoples across the continent. The effects of that deep story linger today in stereotypes, systemic racism, and how we think about what work is.
In 1619, enslaved Africans arrived for the first time in what would become the United States. White European enslavers brought them to the New English colony of Virginia for one purpose: to work. By the time of the American Revolution, more than 500,000 people were enslaved in the United States, and by the Civil War that number had reached nearly 4 million. Looking back at this violent system, it's impossible not to feel horror at the way white enslavers treated other human beings. You may be asking, how could they do that? How could the same man who wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal also enslave people? It seems completely dissonant to us, and it should. But what we're doing today is looking at how deep stories can smooth over that dissonance and allow someone to persuade themselves that their violent actions are the right or only thing to do. For as long as there has been enslavement, there have been people thinking about why it is or isn't right. One of the most frequent arguments made in defense of enslavement was that Black people were inherently lazy and disinclined to work. Let's take a look at this example from a pamphlet written by Thomas Roderick Dhu in 1832, which claims to compare the work output from enslaved and free Black people. Dhu writes, "It is well known to everybody that slave labor is vastly more efficient and productive than the labor of free Blacks. In the free Black, the principle of idleness and dissipation triumphs over that of accumulation and the desire to better our condition. The animal part of the man gains the victory over the moral." He's categorizing Black people as bad workers and using the moral judgment inherent in that category to defend enslaving them. You'll notice that he juxtaposes that, quote, animal part of man with the, quote, moral. The animal part sinks down in repose. It rests instead of laboring. The moral part, in contrast, gets up and works energetically to accumulate money and property. Dhu is weaving together all of these ideas about what is human, what is moral, and what is civilized. Other defenders argued along similar lines that enslavement was moral and civilizing for Black people because it converted them to Christianity. And according to some defenders, being Christian would make enslaved workers more obedient, diligent, and efficient. In a sermon published in 1757, preacher and enslaver Samuel Davies appealed to enslavers' own self-interest, arguing that they ought to educate their slaves because Christianity was a more effective means of discipline than whipping or other forms of violence. Davies' version of Christianity taught that efficient, diligent work was a moral duty for people who were enslaved. It's the Protestant work ethic, again. And here we can see clearly how this deep story legitimized white supremacy, because only certain kinds of work count in these white Protestants' view. Work, in these cases, means activity that contribute value to a capitalist economy designed by and for white people. It's a really narrow definition of work, and excludes all kinds of labor that are uncompensated, but no less vital for individuals and communities to survive. Think about how much work it took to set up and maintain the Underground Railroad. Thousands of free Black people provided transportation, food, and shelter to runaways, just as they had long before the abolitionist movement. That wasn't just spontaneous heroism. Someone had to change the wagon wheels when they broke. Someone had to build hiding places for runaways. Someone had to purchase or grow food and cook meals to feed them, wash the dishes from those meals, launder and sew clothing. All of that was work. Black abolitionists wrote countless letters and attended many conventions to establish the networks needed for the railroad to operate. They lobbied white abolitionists for their support, and they traveled widely to share their stories in hopes of persuading others to join their cause. This is a whole category of work that white enslavers like Dew and Parsons refused to see, because to them, work meant labor prescribed by white people that benefited the white economy. My point is that conventional white Protestant definitions of work deliberately erase the work of resistance to white power by characterizing it as laziness. That narrow definition of work also played a big role in how white Americans treated Native Americans, especially as the United States expanded westward in the 19th century. In 1819, Congress passed the Indian Civilization Fund Act, appropriating federal money to pay Protestant and Catholic missionaries to educate Native Americans in white European ways of living, or what Congress called civilization. White leaders believed that assimilating people into white culture would be less expensive and more humane than simple genocide. In 1879, Richard Henry Pratt founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, the first of many off-reservation boarding schools for Native children. There, Pratt implemented his infamous education philosophy: kill the Indian, save the man. In practice, that philosophy meant that the school banned all expressions of tribal identity, and white teachers taught students to despise their heritage. When they arrived at the schools, white teachers shaved boys' heads and cut girls' hair short. For children whose communities typically only cut hair as a sign of mourning, this was a huge violation. Luther Standing Bear, a Lakota boy who was one of the first students at Carlisle, said that when my hair was cut short, it hurt my feelings such that tears came to my eyes. I felt that I was no more an Indian, but would be an imitation of a white man. Students were also assigned Anglo names and dressed in European-style uniforms instead of their traditional clothing, prohibited from speaking anything except English, and fed what white Americans ate. They were taught the values of white society: discipline, order, and self-restraint, and that Christianity was the true religion. Amidst this violence, Native children were trained to work in the ways that white people worked. Girls were taught domestic skills common in most white households, and boys were taught to farm and do manual labor. Students were usually responsible for growing or raising the food for the school, and for the maintenance of the school buildings and grounds. Instead of doing the kinds of work that were necessary to sustain Native communities, as they would have done with their families, students learned to do the work of white civilization. In 1872, a Reverend Thomas Williamson wrote to the U.S. Board of Indian Commissioners about his successes at a residential school in St. Peter, Minnesota. I would like if you could see our boys work in our garden, see the field of potatoes we are raising for the school. And I think you would agree with me that the Indian boys work as well as such a set of white boys would work in a boarding school. This site would answer the question whether the Indian will work and can be civilized. At Carlisle and many other residential schools, students would spend mornings learning to read and write and afternoons working in nearby white communities. In some schools, students were sent to live with families they worked for, the girls as domestic help and the boys as ranch hands. White families paid the school directly, and though those wages were supposed to be passed on to the student workers, they had to ask the school to disperse their money and sometimes had trouble obtaining it. As you might expect, some students resisted these work programs, running away or writing back to their schools to ask to return or to be placed elsewhere. But some students internalized Pratt's lessons about religion and work. A government agent in Florida reported in 1881 that James Bearhart, one of Pratt's first students, had returned to his community upon graduation, eager to work. The Bible religion, he said, has work right along with it, pays to work, and it is honorable to work. In these programs, we can see that the purpose of residential schools wasn't just about teaching students to read and converting them to Christianity. The schools were an efficient way of making Native children useful assets to the white economy, in a way that minimized government spending in the short and long term. For Native children in these schools, like enslaved and free Black people, what counted as work was limited to what white people found useful. The work students did to resist their incarceration and indoctrination was enormous. Students ran away from schools and job placements, slowed down their work as a form of protest, covertly kept their traditions, names, and languages alive among themselves, and subverted white teachers' efforts to erase their cultures. Their families also worked hard to protect students from being taken to schools in the first place, by hiding them or sending them away when government officials came to collect them. Families were punished harshly for these efforts. In 1895, a Hopi community in Arizona refused to surrender their children. In response, the government imprisoned 19 Hopi men in Alcatraz for a year. Native families would aid and abet runaway students, and they would also make long journeys to visit their children at the schools with no guarantee they would be allowed to see them. But these efforts to protect Native families, communities, and cultures did not register to the white people in power as work, much less as civilization. How could the violence of enslavement in residential schools happen? In part, it could happen because of how the idea of work was racialized and moralized at the same time. White Christians in power believed that everyone had a moral obligation to do work the same way they did. But Black and indigenous people weren't working like white people. They had their own ways of working and their own goals to work toward. But this allowed white Christians to feel justified, obligated, even righteous in compelling Black and indigenous people to work like white people. Many Americans still think about work in similarly narrow ways. We see it in welfare policy and political campaigns. Essentially, anything that doesn't contribute value to an economy designed to benefit white people doesn't count. We'll talk about that lingering deep story and its effects in a later episode. In the meantime, I invite you to reflect on your own ideas about work. Think of some people you know who work in the typical sense, and some who don't. What do they do, and why? Who does it benefit? What's the difference between activities that count as work and ones that don't? I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.